Okinawa, April 1945. Somewhere in the south of the island, in a series of caves that honeycombed the limestone ridgeline, a Japanese infantry officer was writing in his field diary. The Americans had been ashore for 3 weeks. The first large-scale night attacks had already been attempted, and they had not gone the way anyone expected. He did not know why. What he wrote in that diary, later recovered and translated by American intelligence officers, was not a tactical analysis. It was a question. He wrote, "How do they see us?" That question would be asked again and again over the next 82 days of fighting. In diaries recovered from the dead, in radio intercepts, in the formal interrogations of prisoners taken throughout the campaign, it was asked by men trained in a doctrine built on the certainty that darkness was theirs to use. That the American soldier, well-equipped, well-fed, lethal in daylight, was at night as blind as anyone else. He was not. This is the story of what the United States Army brought to Okinawa, that the Japanese had never encountered. What happened when Japanese soldiers built their entire defensive night strategy around an assumption that was no longer true, and what Japanese officers admitted after the war about what it had cost them. Before the Pacific War began, Japanese military doctrine had developed a clear answer to a problem that every serious planner in Tokyo understood. The United States was larger, richer, more industrially capable, and if it chose to fight seriously, it would eventually produce weapons and ships and aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. The doctrine that emerged from this understanding was not designed to win a long war of attrition. It was designed to inflict enough pain, quickly enough, that America would negotiate rather than sustain the cost of total victory. Night combat was central to this plan, not as a supplement to daylight operations, as a primary instrument. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow, we've got something special lined up just for you. The Imperial Japanese Army had invested heavily in training soldiers for darkness, night movement, navigation by stars and terrain, silent approach techniques, coordinated infiltration of enemy perimeters. The logic was straightforward. In daylight, American firepower was decisive. Machine guns, artillery, close air support, naval gunfire from ships that never seemed to run out of shells. The weight of metal the United States could put on a target in broad daylight was something Japan could not match and did not try to. But at night, that calculus changed. Visibility dropped. Artillery needed known targets. Aircraft couldn't see. And American soldiers, the doctrine held, did not train as seriously for night operations as their Japanese counterparts. This was not entirely wrong. Early in the Pacific War, it was substantially correct. Japanese night attacks had produced genuine results. Guadalcanal saw multiple successful Japanese infiltrations of American perimeters, causing casualties and confusion at a moment when American forces were already stretched thin. Later operations showed the same pattern. Aggressive Japanese night movement forced Americans onto the defensive after dark, disrupted supply lines, and kept garrison troops chronically underslept and on edge. The lesson the Imperial Japanese Army drew was clear. Night was their domain. Train the soldiers to use it. Accept the losses daylight brought. Survive until dark. And work. By the time planning began for the defense of Okinawa, this doctrine was built into everything. The assignment given to General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the 32nd Army, was in many ways defined by it. Ushijima had approximately 100,000 troops. He faced an American landing force that would eventually total around 180,000 men, supported by the most powerful naval and air force assembled in one theater to that point in the war. He could not match that in the open. He did not try. His plan was to fight from the interior of the island, from caves and tunnels and prepared fortifications in the rugged southern terrain, bleed the Americans through attrition during the day, and use the nights to counterattack, resupply, and restore positions that daylight had degraded. The night operations served a specific logistical function as much as a tactical one. Rotating wounded out of forward positions required darkness, because the routes between positions were under observation and fire during daylight. Bringing ammunition and food forward, through ravines, that American air and naval bombardment made impassable during the day, required darkness. Counterattacking positions lost in the afternoon required darkness to approach, without being observed and engaged at range. If the nights became unsafe, all of that collapsed. Resupply became a crisis. Casualties accumulated without rotation. Counterattacks became daylight operations against prepared positions with full fire support available, which had the results daylight attacks always had. The defensive timeline compressed sharply. Forces that could sustain a long fight by using darkness to maintain themselves became forces that could only absorb punishment and die in place. Ushijima understood this. His staff understood this. Every battalion and regimental commander understood this. The knights had to work. And the device that changed what working meant was officially designated the M3 Sniperscope, mounted on the M2 carbine. Earlier versions had been developed under the designation T3, and the system had been through several iterations before reaching something approaching practical field use. By the time units shipped for Okinawa, it was functional. Not elegant. Not the kind of thing anyone would describe as polished equipment, but functional. The principle was infrared. The scope mounted on the carbine was paired with an infrared spotlight, powered by a battery pack carried by the operator. The spotlight emitted light in wavelengths beyond the visible spectrum. The human eye cannot detect infrared. The scope could. It converted the reflected infrared light bouncing back from whatever stood in the beam into a visible image on a phosphor screen. Within a range of roughly 70 to 125 yards depending on conditions, a soldier carrying this system could see a man in complete darkness. Not clearly, not with the resolution of daylight optics. The image was greenish, dim, low definition, but well enough to track movement, identify a human figure, and engage a target that had no idea it was visible. The whole system was heavy. The scope, the spotlight, the battery pack. Training was required to use it effectively, and that training had been conducted through 1944 and into early 1945, well before the Okinawa landing. Battery life was limited, which meant the devices had to be used selectively, positioned at the most likely approach routes, rather than spread thin across an entire perimeter. The infrared spotlight had one theoretical vulnerability. Any enemy equipped with their own infrared viewing capability could potentially detect the beam and locate the operator. Japan had no infrared equipment. The vulnerability was irrelevant. The 96th Infantry Division brought the M3 system to Okinawa. Elements of the 7th Infantry Division used versions of it as well. The deployment was not massive in scale. These were not thousands of devices distributed across an entire army. But the units that had them positioned them at perimeter points covering approaches that Japanese forces had been using for night infiltration. And what happened in the weeks following the initial landings was documented in unit after-action reports because the results were notable enough to record. To understand why the results mattered, you need to understand what night combat in the Pacific had looked like before this. American defensive positions after dark operated under a specific kind of institutional anxiety. You knew the Japanese moved at night. You knew they were skilled at it, disciplined, quiet, trained in infiltration tactics that had been refined across years of operations in China and across the Pacific Islands. You couldn't see them. You could hear them sometimes, or thought you could, which produced a particular kind of nervous fire, bursts into the dark at suspected movement. Grenades lobbed toward sounds that may or may not have been men. Sustained fire at uncertain targets that burned through ammunition and produced no confirmed results, while simultaneously announcing your position to anyone listening. This was the rational response to complete blindness. You cannot aim at what you cannot see. You can only fire at where the noise came from, and hope. Both sides understood this. The Japanese planned around it. Darkness was not merely cover. It was a force multiplier, a way of neutralizing American firepower advantages by operating in conditions where those advantages largely ceased to function. The night was theirs. They had trained for it. They believed in it. The M3 changed the premise. The first encounters did not read as dramatic in the raw reports. They appeared as brief engagements, single shots or short bursts at close range. Casualties sustained by the approaching force. No friendly casualties. The kind of contact that in daylight would not particularly stand out. At night, in the context of an army that had been trained to expect confused and reactive American fire in darkness, these results did not immediately make sense. Japanese night movement at the perimeter level followed established protocols. Small groups. Careful noise discipline. Routes identified during daylight observation. moving slowly, with the confidence that came from training and from a long institutional belief that darkness was an ally. From 80 yards away, through a phosphor scope fed by an infrared beam, none of that discipline made any difference. The soldiers moving across that ground were visible, tracked, engaged when the angle and the range were right. The survivors who made it back to Japanese lines reported that they had been seen. They did not know how. They had moved correctly. They had done everything the training specified. The darkness should have covered them. It had not. The first institutional response was skepticism. Night combat reports were frequently confused. Soldiers under fire in darkness, misidentified sources of fire, overstated casualties, and described contacts in ways that didn't align when compared across accounts of the same engagement. It was possible, and initially assumed, that what had happened was conventional perimeter fire that had gotten lucky. Americans had heard movement, fired into the noise, and connected by chance. This explanation lasted until the pattern made it impossible to sustain. At Kakuzu Ridge in April, at positions on the Shuri Line in May, the same results kept appearing in the morning reports. Night approaches that should have been concealed were meeting accurate, immediate fire. Infiltration attempts that previous experience suggested should succeed were failing at the outer perimeter rather than deep inside American positions, which is where significant contacts in previous campaigns had typically occurred. Men were dying at the point of initial movement, not after prolonged, confused night engagements. The shooting was too fast, too accurate, and too consistent with knowing exactly where the targets were. Japanese prisoners taken in late April and into May were asked about this. Not all of them knew much. Infantrymen at the squad level rarely do, but some had heard the conversation in their positions before capture, and what they reported was consistent. The units they came from had stopped trusting their own night movement protocols. Soldiers trained to believe in darkness as protection were no longer confident in it. Some theorized that Americans had infiltrators among them, Japanese informants signaling positions from within the perimeter. Others described American optics in terms they couldn't make technically precise but understood operationally. They knew something had changed. They did not know what. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Here it is worth pausing on what that uncertainty meant practically. General Ushijima's defensive plan for Okinawa required the nights to function differently than the days. The nights were for movement, resupply, rotation, counterattack. All of those things depended on Japanese soldiers being able to move across ground after dark, without being observed. If they could be observed, they could be killed before they reached their objective. If they could be killed before they reached their objective, the supply runs stopped. The wounded stayed in the forward caves. The counterattacks didn't happen. The defensive timeline shortened from weeks to days. The unit diaries recovered from the Shuri Line positions trace this compression without fully understanding its cause. Officers writing in May about casualties taken at the perimeter, under conditions that should have been safe. Notes that the previous night's approach had been met by fire, suggesting visibility rather than guesswork. The tone in some of these entries is something closer to bewilderment than tactical analysis. They had trained for a particular war. The war they had trained for and the war they were actually fighting had diverged somewhere, and the gap was showing in the casualty figures every morning. One detail from American after-action reports captures the texture of this better than broader casualty numbers do. In previous Pacific campaigns, American defensive perimeters at night had a characteristic sound: nervous fire, bursts triggered by movement that may or may not have been real, followed by silence, followed by another burst. Soldiers who couldn't see but knew things moved in the dark, firing at their own uncertainty. The positions equipped with the M3 system were quiet, conspicuously quiet, until they weren't. Until a Japanese approach reached the range at which the scope could resolve a figure clearly enough to engage, at which point the response was a single aimed shot, or two, producing results. Then quiet again. No panicked bursts into the dark. No sustained fire at uncertain targets. Just a shot at whatever was actually there. Several Japanese accounts, from diaries and from later interrogations, describe this quiet as more unsettling than conventional perimeter fire. Conventional fire could be mapped. You could identify the positions making noise, determine their arcs, find the gaps. Silence was harder to plan around. You didn't know if it meant nothing was there, or if it meant something was there and watching you and choosing its moment. For soldiers trained to use darkness and silence as offensive tools, having those tools turned back on them was disorienting in a way that heavy fire simply wasn't. One prisoner, through an interpreter, described it to an American intelligence officer sometime in May 1945. They shoot, and then they stop, and you don't know if they have seen you or if there is nothing. And then another one. But you never heard anything before it. That is not a technically sophisticated observation. It is a man trying to describe what it felt like to move at night against an enemy that could see him. The best he could do was say that he never heard anything before the shot, which was accurate. There was nothing to hear. The infrared light was invisible. The scope made no sound. There was only darkness, and then a bullet from the darkness, from a direction that gave no warning. The M3 Sniperscope did not win the Battle of Okinawa. The battle was won by the same grinding combination of artillery, naval fire, infantry assault, and sheer attrition that characterized every major Pacific campaign. The device was one tool among many, deployed in limited numbers, with real limitations in range and battery life and image quality. But it did something that the casualty figures alone don't capture. It removed from Japanese planning one of its foundational assumptions. The night had been reliable. The darkness had been a resource, something that could be scheduled, routed through, depended upon. When that assumption broke, when soldiers who had trained their entire military lives around the certainty of concealment in darkness found that the certainty was gone, the disruption went deeper than any single engagement could measure. You can adapt to an enemy that hits you harder. You adjust your positions, deepen your cover, change your approach angles. You cannot easily adapt to an enemy that has changed the rules of the environment itself. The Japanese at Okinawa spent weeks trying to understand what had happened to their knights. By the time the answer was clear enough to act on, there was very little left to act with. The infrared beam swept across the dark ground and found what was there. And what was there never knew it had been found until the quiet ended. The formal accounting came after the battle ended in late June 1945, with the deaths of both Ushijima and his chief of staff Isamu Cho, following the Japanese convention that a commanding officer did not survive a defeat of that scale. There was no single senior figure sitting across a table from American officers that autumn, walking methodically through what had failed and why, in the way that Ozawa Jisaburo had done after the Philippine Sea. What there were the surviving officers at battalion and regimental level, and the formal interrogations the American occupation forces conducted in the months following surrender. Those interviews were numerous, and in their accumulated weight they said something consistent. Night vision equipment was not always named correctly in these accounts. Some officers called it simply night glasses. Others described a device that used light not visible to the human eye, which was approximately correct. A few had received reports specific enough to understand the basic principle of infrared, though not the technical specifications. What was consistent across the interviews was the description of the effect, American fire in darkness, that was too accurate to be guesswork. Positions engaged before the approaching soldiers had any indication they had been seen. The sense, expressed in different ways by men trying to describe something that had no name in their tactical vocabulary, that the darkness had simply stopped working. One regimental officer, interviewed in late 1945, described the period from mid-May onward as a time when his unit had stopped planning night operations with any confidence in the outcome. Not because the men wouldn't go, they would go, but because the results had become unpredictable in a way that daylight results, however costly, never were. In daylight, you knew what you were walking into. In darkness, apparently, you could no longer be certain what could see you. An army that cannot predict the conditions of its own operations cannot plan. It can only react. Reacting is not the same as fighting. What the post-war interviews kept returning to, in different language but the same shape, was a problem that appears elsewhere in the Pacific War's institutional record. The information was there. Evidence was accumulating in the morning reports from April onward. The experience that something had fundamentally changed about night movement was available to every officer who read the casualty logs. What was absent was a structure that could take that evidence seriously fast enough to matter. The Japanese army in 1945 was fighting with the same assumptions about darkness that had governed its training doctrine through the 1930s. Night is ours, not because the available technology had been systematically surveyed and a reasonable conclusion drawn about current conditions, Because it had always been true. Because the soldiers believed it. Because the entire training framework was built around it. And to doubt it would be to doubt the framework itself. That kind of assumption stops feeling like an assumption. It starts feeling like a law of nature. Night means blindness. Night has always meant blindness. Night will continue to mean blindness. American engineers at Fort Belvoir had put a phosphor screen and an infrared spotlight together and mounted the result on a carbine. In doing so, they had not merely built a useful weapon, they had invalidated a doctrine. Not slowly, through a long process of operational experience that gave the Japanese time to recognize and respond. Immediately, at the point of first contact, without warning, without any public announcement that the rules had changed. The Japanese had no mechanism to recognize what had happened quickly enough to change anything about it. The information was available. Japanese forces began experiencing unusual results at night perimeters in April 1945. By May, the pattern was clear enough that individual officers were noting it in diaries and reports. By June, units had operationally stopped trusting night movement in ways they couldn't fully articulate. The experience was there. What was not there was a system for taking that experience, identifying its technical cause, and translating that identification into a change of approach before the battle was decided. One captured officer put it plainly, without quite understanding how plain he was being. We knew the nights had changed. We did not know what had changed them. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. His unit had accumulated weeks of evidence. The evidence pointed clearly at a single cause. The cause remained invisible to them, not because it was hidden, but because they had no category for it. Their doctrine had no room for an enemy that could see in the dark. So the evidence that an enemy could see in the dark kept getting processed as something else. Lucky fire, informants, sound detection equipment, some other explanation that fit inside the existing framework. The framework itself was the problem. And frameworks, once institutional, are nearly impossible to revise under fire. The technology itself, by the standards of what would come later, was primitive. The M3 scope produced an image that a modern night vision operator would find nearly unusable. The range was short, the battery life was limited. The weight of the full system was substantial for infantry use. American military analysts writing about the Okinawa deployment in the months after the battle treated it as a successful limited field test of a technology that would need significant development before it reached its full potential. They were right about the development. Night vision from 1945 to the present is not a gap. It is a chasm. Passive systems that require no emitted light, ranges measured in hundreds of meters rather than dozens, image resolution that approaches daylight clarity, systems light enough to mount on helmets and rifle scopes simultaneously. The M3 Sniperscope and a modern Generation 3 night vision device share a principle and almost nothing else. But the analysts also understood what the M3 had demonstrated, beyond its technical specifications. It had demonstrated that night was not a fixed condition of the battlefield. It was a variable, one that could be changed by engineering, given investment and time. The side that understood this, invested in it, and deployed the result before the other side knew it was coming, had taken one of the load-bearing assumptions of Japanese Pacific War doctrine and removed it. At Okinawa, in the middle of the campaign, with no time for adaptation. The Japanese officers who survived and were interviewed understood this retrospectively with a clarity they had not had during the fighting. Some described it with a specific phrase that appeared across multiple interview transcripts, in slightly different forms, but with the same meaning. They said the Americans had taken the dark, not brought light, exactly. Taken what had belonged to the defenders and made it neutral, something that worked for neither side, or worked for the attacker. In a doctrine built on the premise that darkness was asymmetrically yours, having it made neutral was almost as bad as having it turned against you. You had planned around an advantage. The advantage was gone. Everything built on that planning was now unsupported. There is a military history tendency to locate the significance of new technology at the moment of its most dramatic use. The first atomic bomb, the first tank crossing the wire at the Somme, the first radar return that identified incoming aircraft over the English coast. The M3 Sniperscope at Okinawa does not fit that narrative shape. There was no single moment, no engagement that became famous, no before and after line that historians draw across a single day. What there was a steady accumulation of morning reports across 8 weeks. each one slightly worse than the doctrine said it should be, producing a cumulative weight of evidence that something had changed about the conditions the entire defensive plan depended on. No dramatic announcement, no visible weapon. Just the knights getting more expensive, week by week, until the units that had relied on them most were no longer willing to trust them at all. The carbine with the scope, and the battery pack, and the greenish phosphor image had not announced itself. It had simply been there, at the perimeter, in the dark, finding what was moving toward it. That is frequently how the decisive things work. Not the announced revolution, the quiet change in conditions that the other side keeps misreading as bad luck until there is no time left to read it correctly. The Japanese knew the knights had changed. They never learned what had changed them. In a campaign already decided by firepower and attrition, and the brutal arithmetic of supply, that gap in understanding was not the reason they lost, but it was one of the reasons they could not slow the losing down. Near the end of the formal occupation interrogations, several senior surviving officers were asked a version of the same question: whether Japan could have developed an equivalent night vision capability, given different priorities and different decisions at the leadership level. The answers were careful. These were professional soldiers, aware that history was listening, and that certain admissions carried weight beyond the personal. But the consistent thread in the responses was not about technology budgets or resource allocation. It was about recognition. One officer said, through the interpreter, that the question assumed Japan had understood clearly enough what it did not have, and that understanding precisely what you lack, compared to a specific enemy in a specific technological moment, was the thing the Imperial Japanese Army had been least equipped to produce. Not because its officers couldn't think clearly, but because the army had spent years building a culture that treated its own doctrine as settled, that promoted confidence over inquiry, and that had no comfortable institutional language for the possibility that a foundational tactical assumption might have been invalidated by enemy engineering. In that kind of culture, he said, the information that could have saved them existed. It was in the morning casualty reports every day from April onward. It simply had nowhere to go that could produce a useful response in time. The American officer taking notes set down his pen. He looked at the man across the table. Neither said anything for a moment. What the Japanese army lost at Okinawa was not only the island, though it lost that. It lost approximately 110,000 soldiers killed. It lost the last realistic buffer position between the American advance and the Japanese home islands. It lost the argument, within the Japanese high command, that conventional defense remained viable. What Ushijima's soldiers lost in the caves and tunnels of the southern ridgelines, in the nights from April through June 1945, was something more specific, and in some ways harder to account for. They lost the dark. Not because they fought badly, not because they lacked dedication or will. They lost it because an assumption they had never thought to question had been quietly, systematically, and without announcement made obsolete. By engineers working in a laboratory in Virginia, who had never been to Okinawa, and would never hear of the specific engagements their work decided. The officer who wrote, "How do they see us?" in his cave diary in April, did not survive the battle. His diary did. The question in it was never answered for him. The answer, had he lived to receive it, would have required him to understand that the darkness he had trained in, and trusted, and built his defensive approach around, had stopped being what he thought it was, and that the thing which had replaced it was not visible, made no sound, and gave no warning before it killed. An enemy you cannot name, you cannot fight. That sentence applies to a carrier fleet caught on radar 150 miles from Task Force 58. It applies to infantry approaching a perimeter in darkness, certain of concealment, certain of the old reliable dark, moving toward a phosphor screen where they were already visible and already named. The technology changes. The failure it finds does not. If you've been watching this channel for a while and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.